Let's start by asking you a question about family, because many of the 9 talk about how important their families were in relation to giving them support during that very difficult year, those very challenging struggles, which we'll get to in a moment. But I thought by way of introduction, it would be good to ask you to say a little bit about your sense of your own family, where you came from, what it was that your mother and your father did, to some degree, what were the experiences of your siblings, so that people could have a little bit of a sense of who you were in relation to your home and in relation to your background.
Well, first, I want to say that everyone out there who's a parent, I take a proud parent moment. And I'm, very proud that what Adam has achieved and what he's done. And in preparation for this, I told him, don't tell me any of the questions. I want this to be fresh so that we're not too staged. But background, growing up in Little Rock, I came out of a family of teachers. My mother was a teacher for over 40 years, an aunt who was a history teacher, also long-term of 40 years. Father was a janitor at the post office. And what we had was a kind of nurturing neighborhood. In fact, growing up, I got all of my summer jobs from my neighbors. I worked one summer at a country club as a locker room attendant, one summer as a brick mason's assistant, another summer delivering newspapers, and all of those came from within my neighborhood. But the thing that was striking and that I think really laid the foundation, my mother was a group of teachers that struck for pay equity and for black teachers in the Little Rock school system. In fact, if you go back historically, many of the school desegregation cases arose out of teacher pay equity issues, that there was a significant differential between black and white teachers and what they were paid. And the other part that was also striking was that in 1948-49, I think, there was a black teacher in the Little Rock school system that sued the local school board for equal pay. And you can imagine the moment that she introduced the suit, she was fired. And my mother and a number of other teachers, what was the black version of the NEA, pooled together their money and for 2 years supported this teacher, Sue Cowan Williams, who sued the Little Rock School Board. And of course, the case was handled by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. The lawyer who led the litigation on that was Thurgood Marshall. And as many of you can imagine, in 1948-49, Thurgood Marshall was not staying at the local Holiday Inn. There were a couple of times he stayed at our house, as he had to stay at a number of houses of teachers to support him. So you had this group of people who belonged to the NAACP, were not, flamboyant activists, but quietly held their position, and she was one of them. And that was really the sort of background that your grandmother, that I came out of. And so consequently, when I had an opportunity to go to Central to transfer, she supported my decision. She didn't think it was something that was off the wall. And I think without her support, my dad had died by that time, but without her support, my aunt, my grandfather, yeah, I couldn't have made it through that year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that becomes important to remember, it's sometimes difficult to remember in relation to Little Rock, is that leading up to 1957, Little Rock was understood to be a moderate city relative to many of the other cities in the South around questions of racial politics, questions of racial relations. And yet, there were many, many ways in which it was very evident that it was a segregated city, and that one could see the kind of resistance that eventually came up to the plan to desegregate Central High School coming up as it did. Can you say a little bit about your experience as a child, as a young person of segregation? And based in part on conversations that we've had in the past, can you say a little bit about what were not only the challenges, the problems, the insults of segregation, but also in some ways how bringing together a black community in that way provided certain kinds of resources for you?
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, that, you know, grew up in this neighborhood that we thought was a middle-class neighborhood. We didn't know that we didn't have certain creature comforts, but it was what I call the petty inconveniences of a segregated society. The lunch counters, inability to sit on the first floor of the movies, the inability to, if you went to a department store, mm-hmm.
Black people couldn't try on hats,
mm-hmm. That water fountains was segregated. I always tell the story of your grandfather who fought in World War I, and we went to a band concert mm-hmm. in a public park and were told that black people couldn't attend that. All of these kinds of things, but I also, I guess the coping. There was my 11th grade history was taught by a woman. We all have
This is Dunbar High School,
This is
right?
Dunbar.
Right.
We all, it was Horace Mann, they changed the name. But we all have a favorite teacher story. And this woman taught black history, and then they called it Negro history, using Carter G. Woodson's, one of his books, his book. And we discussed slave rebellions and protest movements, the beginning of the NAACP with the Niagara movement and all. And the thing that struck me about that was that here was something in print that black people did push back. They fought back. Denmark, Vesey, mm-hmm. in South Carolina, the rebellion and this opened up a whole world to me, that they didn't have to take it. They didn't have to take certainly most of this was suppressed. Mm-hmm. It didn't succeed, but it also struck a chord in my head that if the opportunity came along to make a change, I wanted to be a part of it. And I didn't think that this was a foreign idea. I mean, that this woman had put this germ of an idea in my head that you could push back. And I think that, obviously, that Little Rock, Orville Forbes, Dwight David Eisenhower, the other players, I mean, Forbes played the race card because he thought he was being pushed by a segregationist candidate for governor. And so he wanted to show that he had credentials as a segregationist. Mm-hmm. It's reminiscent of what we just experienced this past Tuesday. Mm-hmm. That trying to show your right-wing creds. And what Forbes did forced Eisenhower, because I'm not sure Eisenhower really cared one way or the other about us, mm-hmm. but he cared about power, and he cared about how he was perceived by some second-rate governor, as he saw it, mm-hmm. And that in many ways, Dwight David Eisenhower helped push along the modern civil rights movement, because for the first time, they used federal troops to support the 54 decision. That had never happened.
No, that's true.
And the powers to be in Little Rock were trying to get out in front of what they thought was going to be an inevitable change, which again is reminiscent of what we saw on Tuesday, that there were some folks who could see the change was coming. There were others that stuck their head in the sand and tried to deny it.
That's true.
So here we are, the morning that we were to go to school, the Arkansas National Guard was barring our entrance into Central. The Little Rock school system and the mayor's office and all of them were caught in this dilemma. They thought they had a deal with the governor. They had been working on this all summer. They had a gradual approach to desegregating the schools, and then boom, all this blows up.
So that evening on September 4th, when 8 of you were barred from going into the school, and then a 9th, Elizabeth Eckford, actually had to walk the gauntlet in relation to white members of the community shouting epithets, threatening potentially to lynch her. I mean, a terrible, terrible scene that is memorialized in photographs and various accounts, a recent book that came out. That night, what were you thinking? How did you feel about...
Well, when I first went home and saw what Elizabeth had to go through, I thought for a minute, I said, you know, I don't think I signed up for all of this. Mm-hmm. But then the next second, it dawned on me, going back to this history teacher, that they wanted me to quit. I mean, that's what the opposition wanted. They wanted me to leave, to go back to where I came from. Mm-hmm. And I just thought that there was much more at stake than my going to school. I wasn't sure, I couldn't see 50 years down the road that we were going to elect Barack Obama as president of the United States, but I had enough of a feeling that if I gave up at that point, I would give in to the resistors, and that it was important to try to see this through. Now, I also had some trepidation because I was the only one in the 12th grade. And so it dawned on me, I may not graduate this year, but I said, you know, there's something else going on here. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure what all is going on. I know it's more than just my going to school. And if they're calling out all these soldiers and all of that, I got to try to see this through. Now, we were out of school for 3 weeks. And it was only after the riots broke out that President Eisenhower, in fact, there's a great story that there was a neighbor of mine who said, you know, you kids ought to quit it. Eisenhower is never going to send in troops to support you. Your family's got a good job, and all you're going to do is stir things up and make it difficult for those of us who are left here. You're going to go away to college somewhere, and you'll be gone with this. You created this mess and going to leave us holding the bag on it. And that wasn't an unusual attitude. That existed with a lot of people. But the moment Eisenhower sent in 10,000 paratroopers from the 101st Airborne, and he had a lot of people to pick, but the 101st represented, you know, the victory in World War II, the Screaming Eagles. So obviously Eisenhower knew what he was doing, because if you look at Little Rock as opposed to what happened to James Meredith in Mississippi and the use of the U.S. Marshals, it was a lot, you know, the problems there were a number of people who died and all of that. Mm-hmm. So that the unintended consequences of President Eisenhower, and today Eisenhower's people all say he had a great civil rights record. You know, that's for you historians to argue about. But the practical outcome was that Eisenhower used, you know, military muscle and force
to get you in,
to get us in, and he allowed the individual. We had for 2 months an individual paratrooper who went from class to class. Now, the pressure was, you know, normalize the schools, get these troops out of the school so we can have a normal year. Well, the normal year was gone from the very beginning.
No, and this is something that I also want to get back to, because to extend the metaphor in terms of thinking about 57 and 2012, the idea that ultimately it's a ground game, as it's called, that allows you to kind of get to a point where you realize the goals that you've set. It seems to me that the ground game was the 9 of you in school, day after day after day. 2 months, yes, with some members, either of the paratroopers or in some cases the federalized National Guard coming in, but they left. And then you were dealing with a whole set of different things that were meant to try to break your will in terms of being there. Can you talk a little bit about that? What was the experience of being in school like day to day in terms of people trying to push you from being able to graduate or stay in school?
Well, it was like going to a bad job. There were other things you would rather do. But again, going back to somehow seeing a bigger picture. I mean, partly from the family, from other people. There were a few friends who kept stressing that this was more important than you realize, your being there. And that you learn to cope. Certainly, it was difficult to fight back because 9 of us, there were over 2,000 white students at Central.
Did you really bring that knife to school?
Terrence brought the knife to school.
Okay.
But also, you know, I said we were the first group of students that carried all of our papers and books in our book bag because they continually broke into our lockers. And it didn't matter, supposedly we had these secret lockers that it didn't matter. That they had a ground game, inside information, that there was a cadre of white students whose goal in life was to try and harass us. And that their goal was to try to get us to leave, to quit, to give it up. And so somewhere throughout that year, it dawned on me, if I wanted to really harass my tormentors, I was going to stay there. If I stayed there and graduated, and the graduation, you know, was important for me.
Martin Luther King came to it, correct?
Martin Luther King came to the graduation. I mean, in fact, someone's going to ask me a question about my conversation with Dr. King. If you're 16 years old, graduating from high school, you forget the historical moments. You just wanted to get through the graduation and be able to see your friends. But Dr. King was speaking at Pine Bluff, Arkansas, which was 45, 50 miles from Little Rock. And he was very close to Mrs. Bates, Daisy Bates, who was president of the Arkansas NAACP. And he indicated to her he wanted to come up to witness my graduation. I didn't realize he was sitting with my mother and family until the end. I didn't know he was coming up for it. So I continually say I've got to be one of the few American citizens that Dr. King attended their high school graduation. I think I'm in rare company.
It's a small group. It's a small group. So, you know, with all of these different pieces, going back to the fact that this was a defining constitutional conflict, crisis in relation to the civil rights years, really in relation to the last 50 years of the 20th century, one would think then that once you had graduated, once it had been established that the school needed to be open in relation to this group of students, that the story was done, people recognized the error of their ways, and then life went on. And of course, that was not the case. Little Rock closed its school down for a year. But I mean, even more than that, I guess I would ask you, because I remember this as a child, being struck by this, that it was a powerful event that the people that were close to you recognized its importance of. But it was an event that took a good deal of time to get the general run of people in the country, and particularly people who lived in Little Rock and Arkansas, to recognize as a positive event rather than a negative event. And so I guess my question is, when you think not only about your experience as a student, as a young person, but your experience as an adult, knowing that you had done something consequential, knowing that it was part of something that had transformed the country, but waiting for people to recognize the importance of it for decades, what was that like?
Well, I think, you know, its transformative impact, we see it now 50 years out, 55 years out, as opposed to what we saw, you know, in 57. You're right, the Little Rock School Board attempted to continue desegregation. The governor, again playing his race card, closed all public high schools in Little Rock. So now that old adage about cutting off your nose to spite your face, well, you know, that's, in fact, again, parallel to what we saw this past Tuesday, that there's a crowd still doesn't recognize that change has occurred and that there's a new era washing over this country. The governor created such a fury that then there were a group of citizens that pushed back, obviously, that the schools had to be open, so that the next year, 2 of the 9, Carlotta, Wallace Lanier, and Jefferson Thomas, graduated. They came back to Little Rock, but there was a lost generation of students, both black and white, who had to either leave Little Rock to go to high school, or they didn't complete it at all. And to show you how repressive it could be, I worked on a project, Prince Edward County, Virginia. In fact, the year that you were born, I was in Prince Edward County, Virginia, that closed the schools for 4 years rather than desegregate. So this attitude that somehow you're going to punish, I mean, you ended up punishing yourself. And as we got, I think the events that occurred, all these anniversary dates, as President Clinton, when he was governor of Arkansas, when we were there for the 30th anniversary of our attending, gave a big reception. And
he invited you to the governor's mansion, right? And that was the first time that anybody in a ranking state office in Arkansas had officially acknowledged.
Yeah, that I think most of these civil rights hotspots now are regarded as historical moments. If you lived in Selma and Birmingham.
Haley Barbour wanted to memorialize Nick in terms of the 50th anniversary.
Right, I mean, Haley Barbour endorsing, embracing the civil rights movement has got to be something that none of us would have done. But these communities also recognize that these are now projects that people want to see. In fact, I always tell this story. I mean, I had friends in Little Rock who graduated with me, and their attitude was, why would somebody fly all the way from Japan to see Central High School? And we now are at a point that we understand that this is part of American history, not just Little Rock, but it was one of those defining moments. I guess for me, it was that when I was younger, it was building a career, taking care of children, being concerned about what you were doing rather than what Little Rock represented. I think we're all, the 9 of us, 8 of us now, you know, very proud that people recognize this as an important piece of American history, but it didn't start out for any of us having this longitudinal view about what we could do to change the history of this country. We knew that Central represented the best education that Little Rock had to offer. We had bought the idea from our families that education mattered, and that if you did well on the education track, life could be a little bit better than what you were experiencing. And this was because we had a group of people around us who had a vision about the future, being able to think down the road. I don't know if they could see all of this, but they certainly could see that change was not something you ought to avoid.
So let's switch over a little bit then and think about this moment, how it defined you, how it defined the others that took part of it in the context of recent decades, recent developments, and maybe even the present day in terms of thinking about the election and other sorts of issues. One of the things that I'm struck by is that it's possible to have a conversation or an argument in the United States about race relations, kind of racial politics, racial equality, and justice as a glass half full, half glass empty sort of way of looking at it. And one of the things that I think most defines that, in a sense, is whether or not we measure where we are as a nation, as a community, in terms of how we think about race, in terms of the circumstances and the experiences of a few people, you know, be it the 9, be it civil rights veterans, be it the president, or whether we think about it in terms of a kind of larger set of people, in terms of how everybody is doing. And increasingly, this has now been for a few decades, people have really been pushing this argument that when we talk about circumstances or conditions, say for African Americans, we can't tell just one story and give just one answer, because the answer is going to mean one thing for one group, and the answer is going to mean something very, very different for another group. You've worked as a political advisor, you've been involved in campaigns, you served as a sub-cabinet official in the Carter administration in relation to employment and training, you've been involved in the private sector. What's your sense in terms of the kind of story, for instance, that you would tell to younger people about what lessons we should take from the civil rights movement that don't just speak to one way of thinking about the circumstances, say, of African Americans, but can actually speak to the various different kinds of experiences, good, bad, and ugly in some cases?
Well, I think one is, I always say that each of us will have our Central High School moment. The question is, can you recognize it? Are you going to be prepared? Can you take advantage of it? And
so being prepared to take a risk to make a difference.
And the history that is not told is that we've been greater risk takers than we've been given credit for. I think that's very important. And that it is that story we ought to impart to young people, irrespective of color. It doesn't matter who they are, that they are willing to take risks, to break new barriers, create new relationships, meet people outside of their circle. I always say when I went back to Central for my 50th high school reunion, I couldn't find anybody who was opposed to my being at school that year, you know. Everybody was my closest friend, you know. I knew you were going to do all right, you know. So, and we've all had some experience similar to that. But I think the takeaway is for certainly people to see that because we went through this period and we are now defined as heroes by some people, that's only a small part of it. You know that I've spent a great deal of time looking at this whole issue of incarceration and how it impacts the African American community, both Hispanic and black, and that I think that again, going back to Tuesday, that the forces around Romney didn't realize how much they organized the black vote. I mean, the comments that guys like Sununu made, the governor of Arizona, the Romney son who said he wanted to punch the president out. You know, I mean, all of that just got people so incensed that they came out in huge numbers because they may have had problems with some policies of the Obama administration, but they knew that at the end of the day, this was to be reelected. Forget the policies. That's a seminal achievement in American politics, because we've got a whole lay of the land of political figures who weren't able to get a second term. Mm-hmm. Now the question is, what do you do with the second term? And of course, everybody's coming forward with their petition about what they did to help you get there, and now it's time to pay up, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that this issue of the incarceration, there's a book that's just been written by
Michelle Alexander, the
New Jim Crow, mm-hmm. That I would recommend that people take a look at. Addressing an issue like this, looking at sentences, looking at the disparity between individuals, mainly on a racial pattern. Many states looking at the cost mm-hmm. of the incarceration and their budgets. All of that is something that ought to be examined, and is I think, a universal issue that cuts across, many lines, but anything that moves to address it certainly would move to improve lots in many communities. And I'm here in Chicago. I mean, what we read about, teenage crime and
youth violence,
and gun violence, all of that mm-hmm. is something that has gone beyond just a few people being concerned about it.
No, it is. But going back also to the point you were making about the importance of conveying to young people today to take risks, to make change in society. One of the risks that might be involved, for instance, in terms of pushing on this issue, is pushing against the interests of an administration, of an African-American president who just got reelected, because this is something that actually involves a base, and a pretty important sector of the base, really kind of making that administration have to think in very different terms about what it responds to. I mean, people complain that the president and the administration has been reluctant to speak to anything that has a kind of a specific racial inflection. And so you bring questions of justice disparities, questions of mandatory minimum sentences, questions of mass incarceration, the prison industrial complex. I mean, these are significant questions that signify a sense of a race-oriented, although I agree with you, not a race-exclusive politics. So is it time, and is it appropriate from your perspective as someone who did a great deal over 50 years ago to pave the way for the kinds of developments that we see?
Wow.
Is it time now to push a president and take a risk to say, you need to actually do something to answer these things, not because we voted for you, but because it's the right thing to do?
The answer is yes. And you have to help this president get there. I mean, it's not solely on his plate. I think that he's going to benefit by having a lot of constituents push. I said to a couple of friends of mine that it may be some while before we see another white male as president of the United States, because I would argue in the next 10 to 15 years, maybe sooner, we're going to have a woman as president of the United States, whether it's Hillary or somebody else. That's coming. So mm-hmm. we can all put our seatbelt on and get ready for it. The fact that someone from the Hispanic community, Asian community. I mean, America is what I think we saw on Tuesday, a lot more diverse than many of our eyes, that old phrase about your lying eyes, mm-hmm. that this is a changing picture that has occurred right in front of us, and we represent. I mean, I think these symbols, at least what I finally came to agreement about for me and Little Rock, is that it has been more important symbolically than those of us who were the participants realize. I'm sure if you talk to John Lewis about voter education and what the
Pettus Bridge and
Pettus Bridge symbolized, that day they were just simply trying to push a single agenda. I mean, the Voting Rights Act did as much to change the political dynamics of this country as anything. And here we are, the court's going to argue the case again about what happens to the Voting Rights Act. So I am a believer that the glass is not half empty. I started out at 16 believing I could make some changes for myself and that maybe it would have some impact on some other kids in my neighborhood who were younger. But it was the belief that I think is the foundation of what we've seen out of the modern civil rights movement. Take a risk, advocate change, try to make it broad enough to affect a number of people, and the beneficiaries will prosper by it. I mean, if you look at the changes in this country, some of the biggest growth sectors have been in the South. I always, a friend of mine said that Americans ought to be thankful for Dr. Martin Luther King, air conditioning, and the eradication of mosquitoes in Florida. You know, I mean, that racial attitudes and the other factors made these places something that you'd want to develop. And where we have an opportunity to broaden and show that we all benefit from these changes and development, we're better off, but the changes are coming, so we may as well get ready for them.
Well, it takes all those things that you talked about needing to do, and it also takes one more thing, which is, by all means, stay in school. We should take some time now for some questions, so please join me in thanking Ernest Green.
We do have 2 microphones, if you can use them.
So those who have questions, if we could ask you to come up to either microphone, and then I will ask you to bring up the question. Yes, please.
Some friends of mine and I just this past March had a chance to visit Little Rock, and one of the things we wanted to see was indeed Central High School. And we drove along Daisy L. Gatson Bates Drive, and we didn't know who she was. And we got to the very good National Park Service Information Center that's there and learned a little bit about her. I wonder, could you tell us a little bit more about her and also about that application and selection process to get just exactly the right 8, 9, or 10 students to do this and to handle it?
Well, as I indicated, Mrs. Bates was the president of the Arkansas NAACP. And she and her husband were editors and publishers of a weekly newspaper, the Arkansas State Press. There's a great film that's out. I think PBS has shown it a couple of times on Daisy
Sharon
Bates.
LaCruz.
Sharon Cruz is the producer of it. Daisy was a risk taker. She was somebody who understood that she was not going to be loved for the position she took. And she sort of served, she and her husband, as super parents overseeing that year that we were at Central. And consequently, that street being named after her is, if you grew up in Little Rock, it's as much a marvel that Haley Barbour is supporting whatever he's supporting these days. But that Little Rock would name a street after Daisy Bates 50 years ago is unthinkable.
And then there was the other part of the question about the screening process.
Oh, the screening. Well,
screening.
That's a great mystery. There were more than 9 students that the school board had selected. We sort of, I guess, each of us indicated that we were interested in transferring. We lived in the district. Going back, we evidently, they looked at grades and involvement, all of that, but we were not allowed to be involved in any extracurricular activity at Central that year. So all of our involvement, it didn't matter. And I guess that what they failed to recognize, the students who dropped out and decided not to go, probably didn't have the support in their families that we had. So you ended up sort of a self-selection process of 9 people who wanted to be there and were willing to try to put forth the effort to stay.
Thank you.
You can go over here to Melinda or Mary?
Melinda.
Melinda.
Hi, thank you both very much for the wonderful presentation. It's very moving, I think, for many people. What I wanted to ask is, how did your actions and the actions of the other students impact, if they did, any of the white students' attitudes in the high school, and also how did they impact students in your community?
Well, there were a group of white students initially who attempted to befriend us, but they came under a lot of pressure, threats, and boycotting of their families, businesses, and all of that. Really towards the period of time Adam mentioned when they withdrew the troops, there were very few students willing to stand up and befriend us, even talk to us. There was this wall of silence and intimidation that was brought down. I had a group of friends who supported my being there, and that was very important for me.
These were black friends from Horace Mann.
These were black friends from Horace Mann who included me in all the activity. So I usually had the luxury of the high school reunions. In fact, one year, the Horace Mann they were all at the same hotel, Horace Mann and Central High School, so I could be the go-between between both functions. But it was really those students, those friends who were very important to my well-being.
Mm-hmm. Please.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for standing up for yourself and for me and a lot of other people in what you did. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
I'd like to hear your comments to a Nightline feature that was presented about 2 weeks ago, Nightline on ABC. And the feature was about the Ku Klux Klan and its current involvement in restarting the Klan and working on the same features that they've been working on for decades before that.
Well, I think I don't know the program. Someone else cited it. If you look at the right-wing zealots, in fact, what's the foundation in Montgomery?
Southern Poverty Law Center. And also Klan Watch.
Yeah, the Southern Poverty Law Center has been following a number of these right-wing zealots. And I guess my attitude is the same it was when I was 16, that if we are pushed around by them, you know, we'll never make a change. I tend to push back, and I think Southern Poverty Law Center and others that are continuing to watch it, they need our support. If you got an extra check, this is an organization you should help, and we just have to be vigilant about watching them and not take them for granted.
Over here, please.
Hello.
Hi.
I would like to just say thank you. You paved the way for me. I went to the white school in 1965. I wasn't picked. I volunteered. And when my grandmother, who I was living with, asked, Sonia, do you really want to go to the white school? I said to myself, well, nobody in Little Rock got killed, so I'm going. We didn't have the troops that you had because they were all going to Vietnam. We had no help going into the school that morning.
Now, what community was this?
This was a town called McBee, South Carolina. Yes. My Aunt Pat Harris, who introduced you, had left home a few years prior. So she didn't have the choice. And I often ask her now, I says, Pat, if it had happened in your time, would you have gone? And she looked at me and go, but you were such a rebel, Sonia. Which was true. And I just want to thank you. I also want to know, how did the surrounding community feel about you going to the school? I mean, did you have black people in your community waiting for something bad to happen?
Well, if they did, they didn't tell me. We got great support from our churches, from civic organizations, friends of family. They obviously, some people had a broader vision about what we were doing than we did, but I think generally, and again, going back to people like Mrs. Bates and their local paper, really supported what we were doing, and she helped set a tone that was one that the community got behind.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, my grandmother, you know, we had this conversation, and she told me that if I could handle the young white people, she could handle the old white people. So we were in it together. And
sounds like a great division of labor.
I just want to thank you once again for paving the way for me. Now, that was 65. And 66,
I'm going to have to ask you if we can just make it to a question, just in order to make sure that we get other people in.
Okay, and I'd say by 67, 69, everybody was going to the white school. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Please.
Mr. Green, could you tell us a little bit about, you mentioned, you know, for the first couple of months at Central High School, you had a U.S. Army guard escort, if you will. Could you describe that relationship a little bit? Did he talk to you at all? Did you have the same one? Was there any kind of rapport, or was it just strictly, I'll just escort you to class and that's that?
Well, we didn't have a lot of conversation. I was navigating physics and geometry and worried about the courses from time to time. But the interesting thing was that over the years, I've had an opportunity to meet some of the soldiers who were there. And they weren't much older than we were. I mean, they were there. You know, one day they were at Fort Bragg. The next day they were in a transport plane in Little Rock. And in talking to them, they all said that the experience, those that I met, changed them and made them have an appreciation for what changes were going to occur in this country.
Thank you.
Maybe what we'll do, because we're getting close to noon, is if I could ask all of the questions to be brought up, and then we can try to see if we can bundle them together. So perhaps over here to start.
Oh, perfect. Yes, thank you. My question is, with the arc of the civil rights movement and the strength of the federal government in helping state the case and make it accessible for everyone, it seems like in today's environment, a lot of the challenges to human individual civil rights are coming from the federal sphere, whether it's the war on drugs or the NDAA. What do you see as the evolution of the civil rights for the individual human, and who protects us from the federal government?
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's keep bringing the questions in.
I too want to express my gratitude for the work that both of you do. And I also want to draw attention, there's an exhibit on the top floor of the library called Choosing to Participate, which looks at moments of injustice that people face. And one of the stories it deals with is the Little Rock story. So if anybody has time, please check it out. As an educator, I was interested when you spoke about being at Dunbar and having a teacher who taught you about Negro history in those moments when people are resisting and pushing back. And I'm curious to what extent Daisy Bates or the NAACP prepared you for what you were going to be facing, as is so prevalent in the Elizabeth Eckford pictures, as the NAACP trained like the Freedom Riders a few years later. So did you get any kind of training to face that stuff? And then that's kind of framed in the context of, you said that you could prove your worth by by making it through the year, and kind of connecting to today's situation where some people say the president, being who he is, cannot show anger and ire even though he's getting these labels thrown at him that he's un-American or whatever, and he has to not show this angry white or this angry black man kind of image. So thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Could you please make a comment on the revised Gettysburg exhibit, which now in the last room includes a large picture of the Little Rock history?
Okay. That may be difficult because I know you haven't had a chance to see the exhibit, nor have I. But
could you discuss the appropriateness of it?
we can talk about it in the context of looking at the civil rights movement. Let me just get to the woman over here. I'm sorry.
What are your thoughts on the book Elizabeth and Hazel?
By David Margolick?
By David Margolick.
Okay, I'm being guided by my son.
Let's try these four, and then let's see if we can get these two in. So maybe a kind of quick bundle in terms of what do we do when we are addressing the state not being an enabler of civil rights progress, but an obstruction to civil rights progress? How do we think about the challenge of, I'm trying to remember the question that the gentleman asked before, the challenge of what it means to work, as I understood it, against people resisting and challenging you consistently, whether or not it's appropriate to think about civil rights, the iconographic sort of depictions and representations of Little Rock in the context of something like Gettysburg, I guess national history writ large. I might have missed one here, but let's see if we can get those three and then come over.
Well, I would think that, part of what this humanities effort does is getting a discourse. That it's not just what President Obama does, it's what we as citizens do. I mean, we still have the opportunity to enact and make action.
Mm-hmm. Including protest.
Including protest, absolutely. And that it is going to be helpful, I'm sure, to the president. I mean, because while we had this great turnout, that most presidential elections, the differential between the winner and loser is less than 10 million votes. I mean, 120 million people vote. You have to figure out the electoral college process makes it a lot more focused as to how you win. But if you look at the history of the last number of presidential elections, the differential between the winner and loser has been fairly thin. Mm-hmm. So I think citizens still need to act, need to participate, need to play a role, and that hopefully your attendance at this makes you think about what else can you do as a citizen of this country. Help me out with the...
Well, what does it mean to bring stories like Little Rock in terms of representation into a kind of broader depiction of history, or a depiction of history that isn't about the civil rights movement or isn't about the 1950s?
Well, I think that we're just beginning to, we don't realize how close we've been to this event. I mean, if Spielberg's doing a film on Lincoln, who's been dead 150 years. There's some pieces of this story that we won't be able to tell until some period of time, but we need interpretation of it. And that, again, I applaud what the Humanities Festival attempts to do, is to get people energized about there's still stories yet to tell. People like Daisy Bates, it's not a household word, but you really ought to know the role that she played and why she was important in this struggle.
There was a question about the book on Elizabeth Eckford, and maybe what I'll do is bracket that, but just ask for the last two questions, please. Thank you.
Hi, I personally want to thank you as a direct beneficiary of your legacy of sacrifice and heroism. Every time I get to meet one of you at a screening or a movie or a book signing, I just personally want to thank you. In regards to history, you mentioned earlier that as a kid, you were learning about slave revolts in Denmark Vesey and probably Nat Turner. My concern now is about the next generation learning about those things. I think in a lot of cases, unless you're in an urban setting or go to specifically maybe a freedom school or something like that, our kids aren't learning about those type of inspiring stories. We even know, for instance, in Arizona, they're dismantling, certain culturally oriented history classes and things like that. And both of you as a professor of history, what do you all think about this current tide of sort of selectively including certain things in publishing books for students and what role that might play in the future of student activism?
Thank you for the question. And then the last question over here.
I am truly honored to be in your presence because of the fact that what you went through was the year I was born. Okay, in the same token, I would like to thank you for being able to be in your presence. And the same token, my question is, with an individual as Colin Powell being a Republican, and with women's rights being as they are, why as women how do you feel about Condoleezza Rice being on, you understand what I'm saying? No, don't get me wrong. And I would be honored if you would sign my ticket.
Oh, I think Condoleezza Rice.
If you sign my ticket.
I think Condoleezza Rice
Please come over.
would make an excellent candidate.
You understand what I'm saying? I can't get with that.
Let's see if we can put an answer to the question and a couple of the other ones before we close up. So, big tent in terms of what does it mean to think not only about African Americans in terms of thinking about the civil rights movement in terms of pushing change, but thinking about themselves perhaps more and more as part of exactly that establishment that you were saying is behind the times.
I think one of the faults of the civil rights movement is that they never explained the broader benefits to the broader community. I mean, women's rights, employment issues, all of those are an outgrowth from the civil rights movement, which basic premise was, let's open up this society so we all can participate in it and make a contribution. And that's still our struggle. And it's the lady who about educating the next generation on involvement. It is not the role of the president to hand down on high. We would like that to occur, but we have figured out in this society there are lots of players. There's no absolute decision maker who can hand it down and make it stick. You got to have lots of players in it. And I think what we have found out of this, hopefully, is that we want to be a player at the table too.
And I think also just this question, both in terms of, as you're signing the ticket so that the gentleman can get a seat and get some rest, that's great.
Thank you.
The piece that has to do with thinking about Elizabeth Eckford and that episode with her and Hazel Dukes, the woman who was...
Hazel Bryant.
Hazel Bryant, I'm sorry, who was portrayed screaming behind her as she was walking away that first day at school. Part of that, as I understand it, and I'm curious how you think about it, is that in the same sort of way that there's a diversity of approach, a diversity of orientation among many of this generation of African Americans, to some degree there was a diversity of experience among the 9 themselves.
Yeah.
Elizabeth lost a son during her time as an adult. She had challenges. She was one of the few actually who stayed in Little Rock. The majority of the 9 left Little Rock to go to different places. And so I guess in addition to the importance, like you said, of telling these stories and making sure young people see it, do we have a responsibility to tell these stories in their complexity, that they don't necessarily add up to an easy story?
I think we have to tell the whole story. One of the things about the picture with Elizabeth and Hazel Bryant behind her, you know, I mean, her mouth is formed forever in this negative pitch. I think the lesson learned that, watch the pictures, because this is the defining picture.
Took YouTube and Twitter to establish that now.
Of Little Rock, yeah, well, we all know now, but YouTube and Twitter, you know, I guess we have to get away from cameras. But Elizabeth, we were, there were 6 or 7 of us who appeared on Oprah. And when you get on Oprah, you go cosmic, you know. And she brought Hazel Bryant,
right,
to the show, invited her. And Elizabeth and Hazel have tried some point of reconciliation. I'm sure, you know, the pressures on Hazel from her grandchildren, like, you know, why are you in that picture looking like that? And she's trying to describe why she was there and why she's changed. And so what I take away from that is, you know, one is the story changes hopefully after 50 years. 2, don't be the Hazel Bryant in the picture. 3, that Elizabeth has worked very hard to change things around her. I think that none of us signed on to be historical heroes. We thought we were exercising the right judgment to get the best education we could in Little Rock at that time in 1957. And I guess in trying to wrap this up, you know, again, I go back to this is a personal historic moment for me to have Adam to interview me. Very proud of him and what he's done. But at the end of the day, it's still about individuals stepping forward, willing to take some risk, and try to advocate some change for the better.
Sounds like a good note to end on. Thank you.